Here in chapter 2, we're going to cover some basics about chemistry to help us understand some concepts coming up. So first of all, the difference between matter, mass, and weight. So the definition of matter is anything that occupies space and has a mass. And then that mass is the amount of matter that is in an object. And usually that's measured in kilograms. And then weight is the gravitational force that acts on that given the mass. Okay, so mass is a number that will not change. So whether you're on the moon or you're on Jupiter or on Earth, the mass, the kilograms of something is always the same. This is more the space that it's taking up, the amount of molecules, atoms that's in it, that is its mass. And that, again, is constant no matter where we would be. Whereas the weight is going to be very different. So depending on that gravitational force. Now, as the mass increases, weight increases. But again, our weight would be different if we're on the moon than it would be on Earth. And then talking about the matter and what makes up an object. So we talk about elements and atoms. And we'll start with atoms. So they're the smallest particle of an element that actually has some chemical characteristics. And then elements are the simplest type of matter that's unique, that has unique chemical properties. So a good example of the difference between an atom and an element. So an atom, as we'll see here in a minute, has a nucleus with protons and neutrons and then electrons around it. But a lot of times they exist as an element. So the periodic table of elements shows like oxygen and carbon and all of those specific atoms and elements that exist. The other thing, just real quick to mention here, elements are composed of atoms of only one kind. So for example, oxygen that we breathe is O2. And that's an element. So it has two oxygen molecules that are bound together, and we'll talk about binding and chemical bonds here in just a minute, but that's an element of oxygen because it's two oxygens joined together, made up of two different oxygen atoms. All right, so our atomic structure, and you've probably seen this before, but atoms have subatomic particles that exist as neutrons, protons, and electrons. Neutrons are neutral, so they have no charge. Protons are positively charged, and electrons are negatively charged. As far as where they're found, so we think about an atom as having kind of this, again, area that it takes up, with the nucleus being in the middle. And that nucleus contains the positively charged protons and the neutral neutrons in the middle. And then surrounding that area, there's an electron cloud, which is where all of the electrons orbit around. So the nucleus is kind of our sun, and then the electrons would be our planets. Now, given the number of protons and neutrons, it gives us what we call the atomic number and the mass number. So the atomic number is equal to the number of protons that each atom has. And this is going to be equal to the amount of electrons as well as neutrons. So except for hydrogen, atoms have the same number of protons, neutrons, and electrons. And we'll talk about some exceptions coming up, but for the most part, they're the same. But the atomic number is always going to be the number of protons. So for example, hydrogen has 1 proton, so its atomic number is 1. Carbon has 6 protons, so its atomic number is 6. Now the mass number, because the protons and the neutrons are what make up most of its space, the electrons are really small, they're almost negligent and kind of irrelevant whenever it talks about the space they take up. So the mass number is not only the protons, but also the neutrons. So essentially everything in the nucleus. So again, oxygen, for example, has 8 protons and 8 neutrons. So its atomic number is 8, the number of protons, but its mass number is 16. Again, it also would have 8 electrons, but they are so small they don't affect the mass. already mentioned a little bit about chemical bonding, and again, electrons aren't important for making mass, but they're very important for determining the chemical properties of an atom. And that specifically is talking about the chemical bonds that they form, which are, unions or joining of different atoms together. And there are a few different types. Two main ones that we'll talk about now, and then we'll talk about hydrogen in a little bit: ionic bonding and covalent bonding. Now, what's happening is in what's called their outer orbital or their valence shell, which is again where those electrons line up, the outermost one. They want to have a full outer orbital. So any atom that doesn't naturally have that wants to form bonds in order to stabilize that outer orbital. So they have a couple options as far as filling that. And one example, like we see down here below, is ionic bonding. And this is where electrons are transferred from one to another. So salt is a great example of this. Sodium here has one lone electron in its outer orbital. It can have up to 8. So instead of trying to gain 7 electrons, what sodium's going to do is just kind of bump that guy off of the boat. Okay, so it's going to remove that electron. So then it has a full outer orbital here with 8 electrons in it. And now it's more stabilized. Now it does have a charge though, because now it has one more proton than it has negative electrons. So it has a positive charge. Whenever they're charged, we call them ions. Now that electron just cannot be hanging out in the world. It has to go somewhere. So that electron that gets donated comes down here to chlorine. Chlorine only has 7 electrons in that outer orbital. So it has a vacancy, shown here as a clear dot. So it needs to gain 1 electron. So since sodium needs to donate 1, chlorine needs to gain 1, sodium gives its electron up to chlorine. Now, when that electron joins in to the chlorine, now it has 1 more negative electron than positive protons, so it becomes charged with a negative charge. So opposites attract. So this positive sodium ion that's positively charged, because it has 1 more proton than electron, is attracted to the negative chloride ion that is negatively charged because it has that extra electron. And that's what joins salt crystals together, are these opposite charges attracting between the positive and negative ions. Now that's very easy to break. If you put it in water, they easily separate that ionic bond and it dissolves the sodium and chlorine ions. Now the covalent bonds that we'll talk more about in a minute, this is where they share electrons. So instead of completely donating or transferring it, there are 2 atoms that are sharing electrons to fill that orbital. Okay, so just a little bit more here about our ions. Again, as we said, they become charged. So an ion is just a charged atom. So it has gained or lost an electron. The one that has lost the electron is positively charged and called a cation because it lost the electron. So it has 1 more positive charge than negative. The one that loses or gains that negative electron is negatively charged and it's called an anion. So it's negatively charged because it gained that electron. So again, that ionic bond forms whenever those opposite charges attract together. Now the covalent bonds, again, now they're sharing their electrons. So for example, hydrogen only has 1 electron out here. That first little orbital can hold 2, so it needs to gain 1 or lose 1, either way. So what happens in this example up here is that another hydrogen that also only has 1 electron, so it needs to gain 1, instead of transferring the electron and 1 gaining and 1 losing, what they're going to do is they're each going to share the 1 electron they have. So now both of them have 2 in that outer orbital, and they're both satisfied. Their valence orbitals are full. So the sharing instead of transferring is called a covalent bond. And those can either be nonpolar, like we see here with hydrogen. They're equally sharing those electrons. They have an equal right to them, and they just kind of hang out here in the middle in this electron density. is right in the middle. So they don't really have a charge to them. So nonpolar covalent bonds share electrons equally. One is not taking the electron or attracting it more than the other. Now what happens with water though, for example, here we have a hydrogen. Again, it has one electron. We have another hydrogen over here. Again, it has one electron. And then we have oxygen. And oxygen has 8 electrons. So it's going to put 2 in that first orbital to fill it up. And then that only leaves 6 in the outer valence orbital. And it needs 8. So it wants to gain 2 electrons. So instead of, again, completely taking 2 from somebody else, what happens is this hydrogen is going to share one of its electrons with one of the electrons in oxygen. And then we get another hydrogen. It's going to share one of its electrons with one of the oxygen ones. Now let me get rid of some of this. All right, and now what ends up happening is, again, we have this covalent sharing of electrons between the oxygen and these 2 hydrogens, but now there are 8 electrons in the outer orbital of oxygen and 2 in the outer orbital of hydrogen, so everybody's happy. They have full valence electron orbitals. Now the difference though is that oxygen is kind of a bully. It more attracts the electrons than what hydrogen does. So now those electrons are not shared equally. And as we can see here, the electrons end up spending more time around the oxygen than around the hydrogen. And it gives those hydrogens a slightly positive charge. Again, it's not a complete transfer like our cations, but now they're a little kind of positive because they've lost their electron a little bit. And the oxygen, again, not completely negative, but partially negative because those electrons are hanging out closer to the oxygen nucleus than to the hydrogen. So this has a slight positive pole and a slight negative pole, so kind of like a battery that exists when those electrons are not shared equally. A couple terms here, molecules and compounds, similar. So molecules are 2 or more atoms combined to form an independent unit. So for example, a hydrogen molecule is 2 hydrogens bound together, like we'd seen as the example of our nonpolar covalent bond. And then water, H2O, is also a molecule because it has 2 hydrogens and an oxygen, like we'd seen for our example of a polar covalent bond. Now compounds are substances that have 2 or more different types of atoms that are bound together. So for example, water is an example of a compound because it has oxygens and hydrogens. So here you see water can be both a molecule and it can be a compound. So again, molecules though, they're forming that independent unit. They exist by themselves. Compounds though, we have those different type of atoms that are bound together. So sodium and chloride that make salt. Sodium and chloride ions come together. Now, intermolecular forces are forces that occur between molecules, and these are going to be weak attractions. So we have ionic bonds that are, that are weak, and we have covalent bonds that are stronger because they're sharing those electrons. But then once we form these molecules, they can actually be attracted together. And those are going to be some weak interactions, and those are called intermolecular forces. They're forces holding different molecules together because they have oppositely charged parts to them or because they're 2 different ions. Now, these again are weaker than those that are actually forming the chemical bond. So they're weaker than covalent bonds that are making the molecules. But these determine solubility, so whether they dissolve in water or other molecules, and how they break apart or dissociate. Hydrogen bonds are one of the main intermolecular forces that we'll talk about. So this occurs between polar molecules that have hydrogen in them. So remember our water molecule here, just a quick refresher, It's made up of polar covalent bonds, so between the oxygens and the hydrogens, so oxygen in red, hydrogen in blue. Again, they're sharing electrons, but the electrons hang out more toward the oxygen. So that gives, let me erase this. So that's going to give our hydrogens a slight positive charge, and it gives the oxygens a slight negative charge. Again, they're still sharing them, so it's not a complete transfer, but it makes them have these poles, a positive and negative pole. So again, those are the polar covalent bonds that actually join and make the water molecule between the hydrogens and the oxygens. What intermolecular forces, though, we're talking about, this is where we have these hydrogen bonds that are forming here, because what's going to happen is we're going to get this slightly negative oxygen that's attracted to this slightly positive hydrogen. So this positive charge is attracted to this negative charge, but it's between two separate water molecules. So we have a water molecule over here attracted to a water molecule over here. So these are intermolecular forces holding these different molecules together. And a hydrogen bond is whenever we have the partially positive hydrogen of one water molecule attracted to the negative end of a different polar molecule. Now, the solubility and dissociation. Soluble is just the ability to dissolve a substance in another liquid. So salt into water. It's not always water, though, that's dissolving it. So alcohols can dissolve molecules as well, but we call water the universal solvent. So again, solutes are the molecule being dissolved. So like sugar and water dissolves in water, but it does not dissolve in an oil. And then dissociation is just the separation. So whenever we have those ionic bonds holding those water molecules together, what's going to happen whenever the water comes around those salt crystals is the water is going to completely surround each of these ions to dissociate them or separate the sodiums from the chlorine ions. So they're no longer associated together. Instead, they're surrounded by that molecule, such as water. Now, these ions are important because they can form electrolytes. So we'll talk about this, especially like in the urinary system, and we think about hydration. These cations and anions form electrolytes. So whenever these molecules dissociate, so like salt, whenever it dissociates in water, it forms the cations that are positively, so the sodium, and the chlorine ions or anions that are negatively charged. And these are called electrolytes because they can conduct electric current that can be detected by electrodes. We also have some non-electrolytes, though. So this is solutions, we're still dissolving something, but they don't have a charge. So they don't dissociate, and so they don't have any conduction capability. Moving on now to chemical reactions and energy. So whenever we're talking about a lot of metabolisms or getting and using energy, we'll talk about reactions. And reactions is whenever we have the forming or breaking of chemical bonds. And in any reaction, we have the starting material, which is the reactants, and the ending material, which would be the products. If the chemical bonds are made, then we say that it's a synthesis or anabolism or anabolic reaction. If bonds are being broken, we call it decomposition or catabolism or catabolic reactions. And then again, metabolism is just collectively all of the anabolic and catabolic reactions in the body. So again, we have reactants, we have products, starting material, ending material, and we are either forming bonds or breaking them. Now, in a synthesis reaction, this is whenever the reactants are coming together to be combined together to form a newer, bigger molecule. Again, collectively, this is called anabolism, and these chemical bonds are being made. And in order for that to happen, energy needs to be added and stored in that bond. So this would be responsible for like growth, maintenance, and repair. So making proteins, making carbohydrates, making DNA, etc. These are referred to as dehydration reactions because water is one of the products. Now that's not the point. We're not trying to make water. It's just during the process of forming a bond, water gets released. So it's called dehydration. Again, the point though is to bring these molecules or atoms together to form a bond. Now, again, energy is stored in the bond, so that means energy has to be added. And that energy comes from a molecule called adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. So we have an example here of a dehydration reaction. We have two different amino acids, so we're forming a protein here. So we have two amino acids coming together. In order for that to happen, we need to create valence electrons. So we need to have empty orbitals, otherwise we don't need to form bonds. So what's going to happen in this reaction is a hydroxyl group is going to be removed from the first amino acid, and the hydrogen is going to be removed from the second one. Now that means that now this nitrogen and this carbon will have a valence because they're losing the oxygen or the hydrogen that they were sharing electrons with. So now they need to form a bond. Well, what's going to happen is the hydroxyl, the OH, and the hydrogen come off. That's going to form our water molecule over here. But now the carbon from our first amino acid will form a bond with the nitrogen of our second. So we have created a new chemical bond here. And this is, in this case, called a peptide bond. But again, we have joined two atoms or two molecules by forming a bond. In the process, water gets released. So this is called a dehydration reaction. Now the opposite, decomposition or catabolism, is the breakdown to form smaller products. So if we need energy and we're breaking down a carbohydrate or we're breaking down proteins and we're releasing the energy that was stored in that bond. So again, the point is to break the bond. Now the energy we just added is released. And the opposite is going to be true regarding water. For synthesis, we had dehydration. For these are going to be hydrolysis. We're going to need a water molecule to provide that hydroxyl and hydrogen group that we had removed originally in the synthesis reaction. So we're splitting the water into two parts in order to form the final product. So in this case, we have a disaccharide, which has two sugars, like two glucose molecules, for example. And what we have here, this is the bond that we are ultimately going to be breaking. So we want to break this bond to release energy. Well, whenever we break that bond, now we have some valence electrons. Now we have atoms that don't have full outer orbitals. So we need to replace those. And that's where the water comes in. So this bond here is going to be broken between the hydroxyl and hydrogen atoms of water. And what's going to happen is this hydrogen is going to come over here, and it's going to replace the electrons that were lost whenever we break this atom. And then the hydroxyl is going to come over to our second monosaccharide, and it'll replace those that were lost whenever we break this reaction or break this bond. So by doing that, we end up with, again, the original hydroxyl group on this glucose molecule, again, from the hydrogen that came from water, shown in blue. And then the hydroxyl group from the water will replace the one that was lost when this bond was formed to bring these two glucose molecules together. So again, synthesis is bringing two together in order to form a bond by releasing water. So then hydrolysis breaks that water down to break a bond and replace those lost electrons. Now, most reactions that we'll talk about with metabolism are reversible, which just mean it can proceed either from reactants to products or products to reactants. So an example here, this is one that's used actually for buffering in our blood. So in this case, we have carbon dioxide, CO2, in water, they come together to form what's called carbonic acid. Now, this symbol here, where we have our arrow going in either directions, means it's reversible. So it's possible that carbon dioxide and water can form carbonic acid. So it's moving to the right. But once that acid is formed, it's also possible to break the bond that was formed and go back to carbon dioxide and water. So now the product turned into the reactants. And now the products that were just made were the reactants before. So these are reversible reactions. In the same way, that carbonic acid can also donate a hydrogen and form hydrogen ions and bicarbonate. And hydrogen, as we'll learn, is going to be part of our pH system. So that's donating a hydrogen. That's why it's called carbonic acid. And then we're left with what's called the conjugate base. And then these two, though, the hydrogen can join with that bicarbonate to go back to carbonic acid. So it can go in either direction. So the reactants are always on the left side of an arrow and the products are on the right. And if it is a reversible reaction, they'll eventually reach a state of equilibrium. That doesn't mean there are equal numbers of molecules on both sides, but it means that the rate of production is equal. So we're equally at the same rate going to the right, forming products, as we are going to the left in the reverse direction. Again, doesn't mean we have equal amounts of everything, just means the rate going to the right equals the rate going to the left. Now, the speed of the reactions can be altered by a few different things. So first of all, for any reaction, whether it's releasing energy or not, there's a requirement of energy called the activation energy. And this is the minimum energy that's needed for the reactants to even start the reaction. Okay, so even if it's ultimately releasing energy, like breaking down the disaccharide, there's still some energy that is required to get that reaction going, and that's called activation energy. And that can be sped up by molecules called catalysts that increase the rate of the reaction, and they can either that do not permanently change or get used up. And the main catalysts we talk about in cells are called enzymes. And these are protein catalysts for the most part. There are a couple exceptions, but they are mainly proteins, and they increase the rate of the reaction by lowering the energy needed to get started. So again, it takes less time to pay off that energy debt, having the enzyme present, so it makes it happen faster. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in just a sec. Some other things that can affect that rate, temperature. So temperature increases the movement of molecules, so that increases the reaction rate. So molecules are moving faster, they collide harder and more frequently, which increases the reaction rate. And then another way is by increasing the amount of reactants. So if we are making carbonic acid, if we add a bunch of carbon dioxide and water, the reaction is going to happen at a faster rate because we've increased the amount of products. So if we're baking a cake and we have lots of eggs and lots of flour, we can make lots more cakes than if we only had a few. This is just a visual kind of showing how this works. So again, here are our reactants, and this is relative energy of the reactants. And then we have our products and the amount of energy. So ultimately, this reaction is releasing energy, okay, because our products have less energy than our reactants. So energy is coming out. But even though we're releasing energy, there's still some amount of energy needed to get started, and that is that activation energy. So that activation energy is the energy needed to start the reaction. Then once it gets started, we can release energy by breaking that reactant down into products. And this is just showing a little bit more about those enzymes. Again, they're mainly proteins, so they lower that activation energy, so it doesn't take as long for the reaction to happen. These have a three-dimensional specific shape where they have an active site. So the enzyme has a specific shape, kind of a pocket or groove, to where molecules, in this case, we're bringing molecule A and B together to form a bond. So this is a synthesis or anabolic reaction. So we're bringing these two guys together. So they have to literally fit into the enzyme. That place where they fit is called the active site. Now, a lot of enzymes, especially in the body, need what are called cofactors. And these are non-protein parts that just help the enzyme. So they help in the active site. They're not really a functional part. They don't necessarily do or make something happen. They're just facilitating it. And if those are organic, if they have carbon and hydrogen, which is a lot of the reasons why we need our vitamins, is because they're cofactors, then they also get the term coenzyme. Okay, so we have organic and non-organic or inorganic cofactors. If they happen to be organic, again, lots of our vitamins, they're also called coenzymes. We have others though, like zinc and some of our metals, like iron. They're also cofactors, but they're not organic, so they're not coenzymes. But again, they're helping to do something. So like iron helps attract the oxygen to hemoglobin. So it doesn't make it work, it just helps it facilitate a little bit better.